Good morning, all.
Morning, Court.
Morning, Court.
2020, this is the Design Subcommittee of the Concord Middle School Building Committee. We are being recorded, and with our new Zoom protocols, we'll do a roll call of subcommittee members. Matt, if you could check in, please. Present is what you'd say.
Present.
Matt Root and Chris Popov
Present.
and Charlie Parker
Present.
and Lori Hunter.
Present.
And Court Booth, myself present, and I'm looking to see, we've got one identity that's not a name in our attendees. Oh, no, and now I see Dawn right next to it. Dawn Gorello.
Present.
Good morning, Dawn.
Hi.
So we have as our purpose today to pull together the design subcommittee in anticipation of Dawn and Tim pulling together the entire committee now that the select board have authorized a resumption. And the thought for a central piece of the agenda is to look at a piece of analytical work that Charlie Parker and I conducted. We received permission to do this during the suspension, and it took the form of looking at what we think we know about the design that was in hand when we suspended in the spring to try to understand that. Knowing that it wasn't a fixed or conclusive design, it was instead the one on the table, but we wanted to understand it as that snapshot in time, so that any subsequent work would have some analysis of that design in hand. It's what I like to call the modified treetop. I think that's what we had in hand at that time from SMMA, and we know that Dr. Hunter and Justin Cameron had already started to consider further modifications. So we'll take you through that. One, to hope that it will provide some clarity on what that design might mean to us. But two, and I think equally importantly, maybe begin to suggest a model that this subcommittee, or indeed the entire committee, could use to examine and understand any future changes that either Dr. Hunter and her team or SMMA bring our way. We've had some informal review of this with Tim and Lori, and we'll get into that in a few moments.
Let's not forget, Mike, the fact that we were authorized to work with Mike during the pause, Mike Carroll from Hill, and review his model and understand its applicability and relevance to the situation that we're engaged in.
Yes, and I'd add to that to verify some of the numbers we had in hand to make sure they were indeed A, accurate, B, most current, and we knew the sources. On our agenda, we've got the citizens' comments. We're going to be brief about this if people can indulge us, given our agenda and our tight timeline. We want to end up by 10 o'clock this morning. Any citizen comments? You could raise your hand in the participant list here. Seeing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the Design Subcommittee of March 25, 2020 and April 15, 2020.
This is Matt Root. I make a motion to approve the November 19th, 2020 minutes, or sorry, the March 25th, 2020 and the April 15th, 2020 Design Subcommittee.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Second, yeah.
Second from Dawn. Discussion. Roll call vote, and we'll start with Dawn.
Yes.
Okay, and Lori
Yes.
and Charlie
Yes.
and Chris
Yes.
and Matt
Yes.
And Court, yes, those minutes are approved. So what we want to do is, I'll go to screen share, and we want to take you through a set of slides, 20 in number. One, look at them for understanding the design that we think we have in hand right now. But number two, I think perhaps even more importantly, look at it as a model for how we could examine any future modifications that get made, and how that might either serve that purpose or how we could improve it to serve that purpose. Sound okay? So, let's see here. So, and you have it here, I think.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
And I think by way of process, interrupt us as we proceed. But any substantive discussions, we ought to wait until the conclusion. So again, Charlie and I tried to look at the data that we thought we had in hand to ask ourselves, what could this yield by way of an understanding? And so we know there's a lot we don't know, but what we do know is square footage. And we know we've watched Feingold's 124 go to a 167,000, now a current 144,000. And we knew that when we concluded in the spring that 144 might not stand, but we wanted to look at it. And I'm not going to read you these slides, but I will make sure you get a set of these immediately after the meeting. And you can see here that we know that we're at the cost discussion, the budget estimate discussion, and size certainly is a major consideration, and indeed one that at this point we can control. I am very keen on this idea of focusing on design, size, and cost now so that we don't have value engineering upend a lot of the quality that Dr. Hunter and her team want. And I think this will serve that purpose of reducing the value engineering at the end that could have educational implications.
Court?
Yes, please, Dawn.
I just have one comment, only because I, as a designer, try not to ever lose sight of why we're designing to a size. And I appreciate all that you're doing, and I'm following along. This is great. I don't want to lose sight that the size affects the education. And I don't see that anywhere here as far as delivery of education. So I just want to plant that seed as far as, recognizing, and it's really to your first point, is building what we need. We just want it to support how the town is planning on delivering education, which, as we all know, because we've all heard Lori and Justin so eloquently talk about the goals of delivering education in the future, and how we're trying to do that. I just don't want to lose sight of the fact that the size of the building needs to support that.
I think that's critical, and I hope what you're going to find, Dawn, is that we avoided going there knowing that that's not something that Charlie and I are A, qualified to do, or even B, even authorized to do. We see that educational plan in Lori's domain. So we want her to take our work with that qualification in mind, that this doesn't go there. And that's why this is happening at a subcommittee level right now, because we fully anticipate additional work on educational plan and, more to your point, educational interpretation of what this building enables or does not enable. So
thank you. I appreciate that. That's not.
Keep repeating that, because I think it's important. Because
I often have to. And so that's why it's always on my mind, is that, at the end of the day, this is a school and it's about education. So just thank you for
say it again at the end, would you?
I will. You'll hear me say it again. Thank you.
So we considered 4 levels of analysis. One, using benchmarks, because those are knowns that have some kind of historical integrity. 2, we had data around how the space with that most current design was being used, where we looked at scheduling to the degree we knew it. And to Dawn's point, not about educational efficacy. We're not there. And we're not going to lead that conversation. Third, we looked at what was not core academics and saw that as a real determinant of overall space. So we tried to analyze that and bumped into immediate problems with trying to compare apples to apples with those other benchmarks, because on things that are not core instructional, they get different names, different labels, different ways of usage in other school districts. Our primary here was Gates, and this fourth, the degree to which those spaces are used in terms of numbers, concentration of teachers and students, we did not go there. I think some of that data Mike and Lori are working with, but that was not something that we felt capable of doing at this stage.
Can I make a comment, Court, on that slide? I think one thing we want to keep in mind is that the real purpose of this analysis is to enable us to ask some questions. It's not to provide the answers. And I think going back to Dawn's comments, it really is all about how we look at this from a overall purpose point of view, and what questions we should ask. Mm-hmm. And I think the question is kind of 90% of the work here is getting the right questions asked so that we can have a dialogue.
Thank you. Yeah. So what you're seeing here is 2 guys who tried to come up with a model so that the model can be a tool for those questions after it's hashed out at this level and the leadership level and at the full committee level. So this was the finding that inspired us. That says we should know more, because if we look at one benchmark, which we may or may not have discarded, but at least informally it's a real one, MSBA, we do have a variance to look at. So let's learn more about that. And so we dug into, and you'll see both net square feet and gross footage. Net, because it seems that relates to utility by teachers and students, and gross because that is a cost formula factor here, if you will. And so here, what you're going to see is us pulling information out of Beverly and Situate and to a lesser degree Braintree to say, does this inform us about our current treetop design that we knew in March? And what you're going to see here is that we are over MSBA now when we look just at instructional space net, a bit more over MSBA than the previous slide, but all the others are as well. And notably, you'll see Gates coming in at 8% over. We look then at the ratio of net square feet to student, and you'll see those figures there. Do not assume that the boldface Braintree number of 59 is meaningful being boldfaced. It's not. We're not advocating anything there. That should not have been boldfaced. But you can see the spread there. And this brings us right back to Dawn's remarks, and we haven't even mentioned health yet, and how square footage and health are factors that are rather critical today. But again, that was not our portfolio here. So let's see if I can advance. this
Sorry, Court,
slide.
I have one other question back on that, just because I
Yeah.
don't know the buildings as well. Situate, Beverly, and Braintree, their team teaching model. Do we know how many teams per grade they have?
Uh,
Do they have
I-
half teams or are they full teams? Do we know?
They definitely have some split teams. We've done
They
that.
do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Only because if we're going to point out that they're all team teaching, we want to recognize that one of the goals here was to have full teams instead of going half teams. So just something to think about if any of those have partial or half teams. They don't work quite as well educationally, just food for thought. It's two classrooms, two core classrooms, I think, instead of 4 per team. So you end up.
Yeah, I think that's a very good comment. Getting back to asking the right questions. I think that's a very good question, and it has to do with what is the effect of team teaching on space requirements. We'd certainly like to understand that better, and there hasn't been much in the way of guidance around what those relationships are. And I think that's something that the entire committee should want to understand.
Absolutely. I'm going to leave that to Lori and
Yeah.
Justin, those who are better qualified than I am, but I can interpret as far as space is concerned as needed. But I do know that it's from previous projects I've worked on, it's not ideal to have partial teams.
Yeah, I think
teams.
we understand enough about it to know that split teams would be a painful conversation and decision. I think we understand that. People have asked me, is this committee committed to this team teaching model? My answer has always been an emphatic yes. I believe so. I don't think it's ever been debated or criticized. Rather, it's been explicitly and implicitly adopted so far.
Good, Court. I just have one quick question on the numbers. So the double asterisk at the bottom about Gates. So Gates's number would be bigger for art and music, if we incorporated some amount of area from the high school for the Performing Arts Center, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, we didn't include anything except in all of these calculations, we took the data off of the cut sheet. So for art and music, for example, those are the classrooms. It does not include any auditorium space or performing arts space for any of these schools.
So here you're getting apples to apples to the extent the data allows. So now we go back to gross square footage. And this is where we looked at information that Andy and Mike's team had given us in the way of a pretty big spreadsheet last March. I'm not sure I ever got my head around it back then, but we tried to this time. And we looked at those 8, which are noted on the bottom here. Mike, I'm sure you can get us that spreadsheet again if anybody needs it. This is where we looked at an average of 180 and looked at the treetop design as a current 206. No judgment here. That could be an optimal difference. We don't know. We're not here to make any claims about that. We're simply here to say that's what it shows us so far. And it says that we're 14% over that average of 8. So we can debate, is that the right 8? We can debate a lot of things here, but not yet. I think that happens another time and place. So what does this tell us? Because remember the first slide was the 144. It tells us that the average, were it to be one we tried to conform with, hypothetically, it would cost us 18,000 square feet gross over or under the current design. We then looked at the usage of those spaces, where we had our knowns of 7 periods a day, 6-day cycles, And this was data that I think Justin and Lori had given to Mike, and then we inherited it from there. I had always thought MSBA was 80%. I'm told it's actually 85 as their do not exceed. I don't think that's something we would agree to strive for, but it's a number that we know about. We don't have a scheduling goal for usage for the new building here.
2 cents on that, Court, if I may.
Please.
Typically 85 is easier to accomplish at a high school level. It's almost impossible at an elementary level, and it's a mixed bag at middle school from what I can tell, and especially with team teaching and trying to establish full teams. So I don't know the scheduling here, and I don't know if we've ever set some sort of goal, but I do know that sharing of spaces and dual purposing spaces is the best way to accomplish that. And in most cases, teachers do not own their classrooms at that 85%. Own as in it's the only space they teach in, it's available for their whatever curriculum on the walls and that sort of thing. I do think that Lori had that discussion early on, and I can let her speak to that as far as teachers sort of owning classrooms versus not. So that 85% is almost not easy to get to in a full team teaching model, just so everyone knows.
Couldn't agree more. We know that the educational plan that's being formulated now does advocate for teachers to have a space they can call their own. And it also has implications, Dawn, that we're going to see in a couple of slides from now about how do teachers do their work when they're not live in front of a group of students? Where are they? How does that work? Teacher workrooms, breakout rooms, and so on. Do they have a home, or are they walking around the building with a laptop looking for a chair?
This is my biggest argument, biggest bad news besides the size of the gym. This is the worst thing I have to tell users when I have user meetings, because no one likes it. Not one educator out there, just so you know. But often it's the hammer of the state that we can say, that's what the state says. So, just so everyone knows, this is contentious always.
And there'll be a day when you and I are in front of town meeting and have to articulate very clearly exactly why we're advocating what we're advocating, and where people can understand that walking around with your laptop is not a way to do business. Some of us have lived those lives in schools before.
It may be easier with a pandemic on our shoulders as far as sharing spaces and having communal spaces, just food for thought. It's a lot harder, and educationally it's a lot harder. I've said this to Lori before. Every plan of a classroom that I see laid out with desks spaced, and I get it, it's safety first this year, right? But it flies in the face of everything we try to do educationally. And same with, sharing spaces and having multiple teachers and staff using spaces at one time. So just something to think about.
What is a more reasonable metric? That is it 75%? How far below the 85% would we be thinking?
I don't know.
Sorry, if I can just interject, just real quickly. I think the 85%, just so everybody understands where it's coming from, if you take, they assume that most districts do a 7 period day, or 7 periods in a cycle day. So if you take 6 periods busy and 1 period not busy, that's where you get the 85%. So that it's like 85 point something. So they've rounded it down to 85. So
Mike, get a little closer to your microphone.
Oh, sure. Sorry. Typically I'm too loud, so I didn't want to be too loud. So I think the way the MSBA has calculated this is they're assuming a 7 period day, and they're assuming that the classroom is busy 6 of those 7 periods. So if you do the math out, that's where you get the 85%. If you were to do something less than that, 5 periods out of 7 would be 71%. So just so that people can kind of put that in perspective, that's what we're talking about. That 85 would basically mean that the class is busy 6 out of 7 periods in a day.
And
Great.
we're not, I don't think anybody's striving toward MSBA. I think if we were an MSBA project, we would be discussing how far off MSBA we can move and still get their approval, if I'm right, Dawn.
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
they allow what they allow. If you want to do more, you have to pay for it yourself.
Okay. So what we did was back to this utilization piece. We knew that at one time the core classrooms were to be the exclusive domain of those cores for the reasons we just discussed. And that yielded a 57% utilization, a number we just heard before. And I think this came from Lori and Justin through Kristen. I'm not sure the exact history, but were we to fold in RTI, coding, digital health, and digital literacy and health, which indeed I think is the current plan, that means what happens in the core has just been redefined, and usage now is fully up to 72. And then what we see is the remaining dedicated areas for world language, tech, art, and music, and PE have their own yields, if you will, that are outlined here.
Yeah, I think,
Sorry, Lori?
and I haven't time, I've seen these, but haven't had time to do anything with them. And I can't quite, some of it doesn't fit the day-to-day world we live. So like PE, we're constantly juggling to try to figure out space for them. But I just want to make that point that I haven't mapped it out against the world that feels the middle school daily. So I'm not debating the numbers. I'm just like, that one jumps out at me as not fitting the challenges I know we face all the time with them.
Yeah, and we should debate the numbers where they're right or wrong, not in terms of their suitability for Concord. That's a conversation that you're going to lead, I think.
Right. And I would, you absolutely have to include RTI and some of the elective pieces, because our teachers, the ones who are now on clean teams, 6th grade specifically, 6th and 7th, carry 4 classes plus their 5th class, which is contractual, is one of those RTI intervention enrichment blocks. So you have to go to the 72% because every core teacher has a 5th class.
So there's some logic in that move. That was not one of a painful move as compared to some others that we might be struggling with. Who knows? Okay.
Well, let's clarify this a little bit further here. Mike, you might want to comment on your use of the actual programming information in creating the number of spaces needed. These data actually were derived from the actual programming plans that we got from, or that Mike got from the administration. But you might want to comment on that, Mike.
I think what Charlie's referring to is we did get some information from Lori right as we were going into hiatus here, and we took a look at it, and that's really looking at the current plan with the 2 buildings and trying to relate that to the new building. It's not necessarily trying to incorporate the other 2 buildings into the new building. It's just saying, this is what we've got now, basically, and if we had that going forward, if we didn't make any changes, how would that, fit into this building? And that's what we've done.
And I'm not debating, our teachers have a 5-period day out of 7. So that's going to be accurate that it's somewhere around 70, a little over 70% that the room is used for kids in the room. We acknowledge that we're going to need to figure out how to increase these numbers. And that's the work Justin and I have already started. So I'm not debating any of that. I'm just trying to weigh in a little bit along the way to say PE just doesn't fit what I know is happening right now, that the rest we can not get stuck on.
And my take on that, Lori, is you're going to want to have some guidance from the full committee so that you and Justin are doing that difficult work in accord with what you think the committee thinks possible and wise, rather than guessing.
Yep, that's definitely true.
If you have to do that work independently, it's going to be much more problematic.
Yep.
And if I could elaborate a little bit more on that, Court, just one other comment is the analysis that I did, I'll say, was kind of in a bubble. I did not sit down with Lori or Justin to review it. So some of the assumptions I had, there was some unique classes where it appeared maybe one student might have been off schedule some days. I kind of assumed that one student was being taught individually, that they were going to be grouped in with another group, things like that. So there's definitely some potential adjustments based on the actual, interpretation of the document, the information. I don't think it's far off, but there's certainly some room for some interpretation on some of those items.
Good. Yeah, that really supports this contention that this is an analysis of what we knew in March about the then design, with work still actively underway. So here is where we go out on a limb, and I don't do this to frighten Dawn or Lori, but rather to give us one what if. And this is not by way of advocacy, this is by way of testing a model to say, what happened? How do we look at changes if changes are brought forward? So this is one where, and this Lori and I have briefly discussed this with no conclusions or positions or anything like that, but we're 6 world classrooms to get folded into the core. Then suddenly utilization would leap to very close to that MSBA max for, Dawn would say, a high school, 83%. So that's were space to be still under debate. That would be one move. If we were to do further sacrifices by way of tech, art, and music, I'm not proposing this. Then what we would see is those utilizations go way up from those lower numbers previously, and the overall yield with those consolidations puts us at 81% at a cost of 9 classrooms, with implications for how a core is no longer the kind of core that Lori's been promoting. And we know that. So again, this is not advocacy per se. This says, this allows us to look at the larger implications when you add or drop a room or when you encroach on the core.
I might comment by simply saying it's very easy to do this. It's just a matter of moving the total needed periods from one space or one area to another, and increasing the available periods or decreasing the available periods in the first column based on whether you're increasing or decreasing the availability of those. It just takes minutes to do this in order to see, what the effects are and what the alternatives might be. We may have had it exactly right. The previous slide may describe exactly the right plan, but I think to Court's point, this simply enables us to further understand the impact of alternatives on overall space requirements.
And it's absent so far, the conversation, what happened to that core teacher? Where is he right now? Where is she right now? And that's gonna be part of a conversation if indeed the committee lays out some space parameters such that the 144 is the same or different in the future. So again, this consolidation, what would this do for net square feet? It'd be a yield or a savings of 8,500 square feet, or 13,000 on a gross level, grossed up. I won't belabor this one because we're not promoting it. We're simply looking at one potential what if. This one got interesting for us when we looked at the other spaces, because here it got much more difficult for us to look at other schools because they didn't name things exactly the way we did, and didn't use things the way we did. Gates is a notable example where their media center really overlaps with what we consider to be our common rooms here. We don't have an MSBA guideline, if indeed we wanted one. We saw the 8% variance earlier with Gates. We still like Gates as a model. So what we considered other academic were these items right here. And again, where we bumped our heads a few times was on this last bullet, dedicated teacher planning, when, where, how. That's a conversation we're not prepared to have, but we're very interested in it. And we know that's going to keep Lori and Justin up at night sorting that out with any model. So now we do a Concord and Gates comparison. And I'll give you a moment to look at this and see if there are any factual errors here. I don't think so. We've been over this a few times, but we'd invite your scrutiny. You can see that we have a media center and they do as well, but their media center serves a different purpose than ours. Let me see if I can move my gallery view so I can see what's on my own screen here. So what you find here is that we are somewhat over the Gates school, which some have considered a good model because it, quote unquote, felt spacious enough. So we're trying to learn, what are they doing differently that would inform us somehow here. Any questions or comments on this one? You can see it's pretty different. 4 prep rooms, Gates 6 Rs. We have something called a teacher workroom. They don't.
Well, I guess, there's a lot to comment on here, but I don't think we want to spend too much time on it. Their structure accomplishes a lot of what we're aiming for, but in very different ways. They do have split teams. So I just want to name that. The teachers don't have their own rooms. So those planning rooms are their lunch rooms, their prep rooms, their home base, all of that, which is great. And actually that's something we've put back out to the teachers last week, knowing we were going to have all these conversations coming up. Their media center, while it says that, those of us who've been there know that that really means they have books on shelves out in the common team learning commons and in the hallways. So I'm hesitant to call it a media center. It's not at all a media center. It's books spread out around the building.
That refers to the actual category that it was loaded into in terms of their space sheets. So
right, it's just a big piece of how they got to the square footage MSBA would approve, that they essentially gave up the library and then spread the books around the building. So it's just very, very different than what we're hoping for. So,
and just to that point, Lori, I don't know if you're finished, but I just basic math added the commons plus presentation from Gates. That gets us within 100 gross square feet of the actual media center at Concord Middle School.
And and you all know there's a lot I love about Gates, so I'm not negating any of the positives of Gates. I'm just saying they get there very differently than the way we've been looking to get there. And much of what we just listed, I've got on the table with Justin. We met with the teachers last week and proposed 4 different options of how to reduce square footage. So,
well, the differences are easier to understand if you go to the next slide, Court. That's what we're doing here.
I have one other comment on Gates and the media center. So they've spread it throughout the corridors, which typically would fall into the grossing factor of 1.5. Right. So I don't know how much of their net is included in their grossing factor as far as if they've outlined that separately than the space you travel through. And I don't know enough about the project. Sorry for the background noise. I have a remote kindergartner home with me these days. But they I don't know how much of that is included in the grossing factor, if any. So that's one thing that is worth noting. Once you take it and spread it along the corridors, it starts to get murky with grossing. So I don't know if taking their number and grossing it up is actually true, because they may have shared some of that space with the corridor, which actually would fall into part of the grossing factor at 1.5. Just something to think about.
My layperson's takeaway is there's a lot around Gates quality to look at, but a lot of the empirical evidence here is not going to help us.
Unless we knew more. If we knew, like often we'll do a plan that shows like what's net versus gross, or how you calculate it in order to share with the MSBA and ultimately the DESE when it goes for their approval. But grossing factors are just interesting, especially once you take a media center and spread it, if you will.
But yeah, I think the most simple way to look at this is to say that when all is said and done, we chose in our plan to have a media center and learning commons. Gates chose to consolidate them because for some reason they felt that they could or they couldn't afford to have a media center and a learning commons or whatever. But that basically is the way that comes across to me. Plus, we're higher in almost every category regardless. So that's why the differences are what they are.
And I remember full well that Justin said, I thought quite convincingly, that his vision is the media center is the heart of the school. And I think SMMA heard that loud and clear.
So I think when Charlie and Cord had first showed these to me, Lori, I had a very similar conversation with them about the media center. I think the sheet that Cord has up now, if you look, the Gates Media Center is 0, because what I actually suggested at that time is that the Gates Media Center was more analogous to the Learning Commons than it would be to a traditional media center. So I think on this sheet, Charlie and Cord put the square footages from the Gates quote unquote media center commons and media center presentation up against the Learning Commons to try and make it a more apples to apples comparison, a little more, I think more correct than comparing it to a large media room.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, I think all we're trying to do here is to try to understand, okay, why is Gates at the level it's at and able to do what it's doing versus why are we at the level we're at? And this simply, again, enables us to get to the questions. Certainly we can have a media center if we want to pay for it.
And this is all about space, and it does not include split teams, which is a conversation that has to be coupled with any other conversation. So this is a slice that is part of a larger conversation. We understand that, which is why I think at the conclusion today, we're going to decide that this is a good, bad, or indifferent model, but now there's other work to be done before we look at the next model or the next design change, if there are indeed subsequent design changes. So what does this tell us? It tells us that on the other space, we have 20 square feet, and it is somewhat different than Gates. The important number here is, were we to achieve Gates, and I'm not suggesting that's a cost we're willing to pay instructionally or a cost we're willing to bear financially. That's not my portfolio here, but the difference is 5,800 square feet.
Some of, I'm sorry, Court, one more thing. Some of the partial teams or half teams manifest themselves in those numbers. For instance, the prep rooms, that looks to me like it's 2 prep rooms different. So we are showing 6. 5. And he's not correcting me. He's giving an answer to his teacher. 6, where the prep rooms in Gates are 4. So
Correct.
that's a manifestation of number of teams. So.
Right.
Well, you seem to understand what's going on here with these columns and what's behind them. I think that problem some of us may have is that we haven't been privy to a lot of those discussions. You know, prep rooms and partial teams and whole teams and, you know, the costs of all of these things. I think that these types of things need to see the light of day, you know, for the design committee and then for the whole committee if we're going to make an informed decision about what to do. So, I just find myself, quite frankly, speaking for myself, to be somewhat at a disadvantage in terms of some of these nuances because they're not written down anywhere and they haven't really been discussed either. So I think that's, to me, the way in which this modeling stuff helps, because it brings out these issues that I think need to be pursued.
Thank you, Charlie. So here we've got a look again at that consolidation idea where we went from 68 to 81%. And that would be a 13,000 foot difference with the gates comparison. And then if we were to try to achieve gates on the other academic space, and that's a big if, just a hypothetical, mind you, that's that 5,800 we just mentioned, that's fully 13% reduction or 18,000 square feet off the current 144. That's what that would do physically. What it would do educationally, we'll say it yet again, that's not a kind of conversation we've had recently. So to close this out, we started with this idea of, yeah, we aren't at MSBA. Does that help us as a benchmark to look at CMS against? And then instructional space, we've dug into that with, again, Gates and Beverly and Braintree. We then looked at the 8 Hill benchmarks, and looked at the utilization piece, looked at the non-instructional space, and came up with one hypothetical that could yield an 18,000 gross square foot difference. To give us an example of what we would have to drive by way of internal changes if we had to have footprint changes dictated by whatever, first and foremost, finance. But second, would we do so against the ed plan? And that's not the conversation we're having yet. And that's just so you have, and you'll have this slide deck, just so you have some of the background information we were using where we broke out what it means to have a 6-day cycle, what it means to look at our population in that cycle, and then go to the most critical piece, which was where we started, and that is the use of the cores that constitute a team model. So I can go back to any of these slides, but I think the important takeaway for me after this exercise was that indeed, if there are other changes that Lori, Justin, and Kristen's team bring to us, this might begin to give us a model that would help us understand it from a square footage basis, and if that's one of our factors in a cost estimate, and if the budget ceiling as we think it exists now is one that is a factor, then we're going to need some kind of model. This might be one. So I wonder if we can open it up just to interpretation. Does it fulfill that objective of a tool we can use when other modifications come our way? And how would we enhance it, or what what's wrong about this one? How does it, in fact, distract us? One way it distracts us is it says that the North Star here is gross square foot, and that would be a terrible mistake, because the North Star here is serving kids for the next 50 to 75 years. So we understand that there's that gross deficiency in this, but only because we deliberately decided to set that conversation apart and have that another day.
So maybe I'll add some updates, since this is the first time we've been together since we took the break. I did just email you. We've been trying to work on the educational plan while we reinvent everything in COVID. So there's a draft with some starts to it. It's not complete, but to Charlie's point of it's not written down anywhere, that is where it will get written down. Then Justin and I, anticipating this conversation in the direction of square footage and costs needing to get dropped lower, we started to outline options the last couple of weeks. Last week, we shared some thoughts with the staff, because they have to be part of these conversations, or at least have had some input. So 4 things were put out to them for feedback, more as consultative feedback, not in any way thinking we were going to get consensus or reach decisions, but at least we've had some options for the staff to consider. And the hard message of the building we've got on, tentatively designed right now isn't likely to be what we end up with. And the hard message of, we have to remind ourselves, and we reminded them probably with a different slant, but they're going from 2 buildings of 151 square feet, 1,000 square feet, to significantly less. So already the 144 is a reduction, and whatever we go less than that. So all of this feels like loss to the staff, and that's hopefully not going to equate to loss in educational programming, but change, like Don mentioned, is going to be part of the discussion, and I don't want to minimize what that'll have for impact. So we proposed 4 ideas to them, and then said they could give us other feedback, and we haven't even had a chance to look at the results. This was just a week ago. One was to abandon this, and I can't believe I've even put it on the table, but we have, because we had to abandon the clean teams and just go back to split teams, because then you could drop some rooms. Another was to not have teachers have their own rooms, and everybody travels more to the Gates model, where they have teacher prep rooms, and that would allow us to drop 1 room per team cleanly. World language and probably special ed pushing into classrooms and not having their own space, and taking up that 6th period that right now, when a teacher has five periods of kids in the room, as you've already identified in the data, it's the 6th and 7th ones that are driving the limited usage. So the 6th period then would get filled up by special ed or world language. And then the 4th option we gave, kind of referenced some of what Court put out, was, do we look at the specialist subjects, tech ed, art, music, all of those, and maybe go more from that direction. So I'll just share, none of that was received with great excitement, obviously, and kind of a little bit of a surprise to them that we were to this point. That said, they're handling it professionally and giving us a lot of feedback, and we're just going to start sorting through that. So I wanted to get to the place where we were trying to queue up options that had, we knew we could identify the educational impacts and then figure out how we're going to manage that, knowing that the 144,000 didn't sound like it was going to hold. So that's where we're at, and that's, I think, options we can continue to bring forward. I don't plan to decide that by myself. I will likely have a recommendation for you, but we're not to that point yet. So that's the work we've been doing. Justin and I spent a full day 2-3 weeks ago, just even trying to remember where, if any of you have had to do this, you got to dig out where we left off and try to remember where we were and what was in and what was out and how we got there. And so we did all that work and then laid out some options, and yeah, so that's where we are, knowing all this was going to be probably our next discussion.
Lori, I it's even painful to hear you say those four options. I don't think any of us wanted to
Right.
reach this juncture. I guess I'm going to turn to Dawn and Tim and Lori again and say, is it premature today to begin to just flesh out process to get ourselves back in a functional position as a full committee with these conversations happening at the same time? Is that something already under discussion? Because I think if Lori's got those four options on the table and she's got to bring them ultimately back to the design team, she's going to need to do it with some confidence that she's not asking for things more draconian than necessary.
I don't know if Tim or Dawn want to answer that. My thought
I,
was this, we'd probably need the big committee to hear where we're at, which I think was what I expected to be the next step, but I don't know. We haven't really talked through that. So it's a good question, Court.
Let me first off, I want to thank Charlie and Court for putting the time in here and to put this into context. You know, at the very least, when we go to the town, are going to have to address the issue of comparable space to other schools. Okay, and why? You know, if we choose, if we're higher, why? Okay, and not only that, I think it is responsible for us to look at comparables to say, here's what we're trying to do, how are others doing it, and why are we a little bit higher? So I think that's really important work, and I really want to thank Charlie and Court for putting the time and effort into this. And I, having worked a little bit with them, I know they're not driven just by it's got to be X square feet or it's got to be X cost. Okay, I think they're really trying to understand what the school, given the educational program we have, the size it has to be. So that's the first thing I want to say. I want to thank them for doing that. Number two, my thoughts as we went through the break were that we have as a committee a balance of three really important things. Okay, number one, we have an educational vision for our middle school that we're trying to support robustly in this new building. Okay, that's number one. Number two, there are also a set of things around that the community finds very important. Okay, number one, a highly sustainable building. Number two, a structure that supports arts in a way that is consistent with the Concord community. And number three, the financial environment for Concord going alone, and we're going to have to fund this at a very high price. Those are three things that our committee has to balance. And we found ourselves at a juncture where what we had designed through the feasibility side looked like it was going to be hard to get all those three things in sync. Okay, that when we took the break, that was my thinking. We have to come up with a way to balance those things in such a way to get the project approved. Because my ultimate goal, our ultimate goal, is to put a project before the town that supports the objectives of the learning that we have and that the town will support financially. And that's what we have to do. Okay, so we have to balance those three things. With that, I sort of initiated two things informally during the pause. One is this work to do the comparative analysis of where we stand versus others, so we understand that. Number two, we met with Lorraine and Kristen, and again redressed the issue of the per square footage costs and why are we a little bit higher than the comparatives we see in other projects. Okay, and and I asked Dawn to take the lead on that and working with them to what are the drivers of that in the design that we have. My goal, or our goal in this process, is to bring that together, the work that Charlie and Court have done comparatively to inform us, the hard work that Lori is doing, generating alternatives in terms of the educational program to maintain what we want in terms of the core robustness of that in a reasonable square footage. What can we do in that regard? And number three, to look at all of those things that may be driving the per square foot charges so we can address those, okay? And I think what we have to do in process is bring those things together in a logical way that the committee can deal with it in terms of alternatives. When the big committee, what we need to do is inform them of where we are and present reasonable alternatives to them in terms of these are ways that we can go. Okay, so the plan is to start in December with a full meeting again. And what I would hope to be able to do in that is to have a presentation that sort of gives this context without solutions, okay? Number two, to have Lori talk a little bit about the work that they have done and where they are or are going to be in terms of a recommended solution. And number three, address those items that may be driving the square footage cost, okay? So the idea is over a meeting or two or three that we get back to a design that says that potentially, and this is always aspirational, that we could get to a roughly $100 million building that supports our educational program, gets us to the sustainability level that we want, okay? Gets us the sort of medium-sized auditorium and that expanded gym, not the huge one, but the expanded gym, and we can do all of those things. So that's a lot, so that's my thinking on it. Okay.
Good, thank
I
you.
agree with you, Tim. Sorry for the delay. I was waiting to see if Tim, he's sometimes more eloquent than I as far as answering process questions. So I was deferring to him first, but I would agree on that end. And just so everyone knows, there's sort of three initiatives. I didn't include sustainability because I'm not sure actively anyone's looking at that as far as how it relates to the size of the building or cost. If that's happening, I'm not aware. I know a lot of things are happening on that end, just maybe not actively currently. So there's the effort we just were presented with today as far as recognizing utilization and size of building. Lori and Justin are then going through the education and figuring out if any of that could potentially reduce the building size. And then all of that relates to cost per square foot, which I met with Kristen and Lorraine. It was either last week or the week before. I'm in a time warp still with COVID, but recently, and I still need to update Lori and Tim on where that ended up. But just so everyone knows, we have some agreement on the general construction cost. That doesn't mean it, fully relates to project cost yet, because we want to understand site analysis and site implications as far as program even on the site. What are we providing versus what's required versus what's been cost in the estimates, but then also just the building itself. So obviously the size of it will directly affect the cost of it, but that all comes down to cost per square foot. So we have some thoughts on in general agreement on what that could be, and then some strategies to, how we might be able to bring some of that down. And I shared with them some of what you were saying, Tim, about trying to get in and around the 100 with the, the core building, but then also some of the increases that we know that the community is looking forward to as far as performance space and gymnasium and balancing all of that. So I don't know if our first meeting is kind of a presentation on these things to bring the general committee up to speed, which I think is what you were sort of alluding to, Tim. But all of these are intertwined and none of them will be made decisions made in isolation. Obviously, the full committee needs to make those decisions, but I think the efforts are underway to start to bring us in line with where we hope the project will come in at. Again, sorry for the background noise.
Oh, no problem. I don't want to, the one thing about the first meeting is I don't want to overburden it with, we're going to achieve all of this because we're just back together for the first time. So I think that a realistic goal for the first meeting is probably to have worked with, the other thing that I asked Mike is to coordinate with Kristen relating to a schedule that gets us to the fall of next year, incorporating the discussions that we're going to have that we talked about today. So at our first meeting to go over that schedule, to say, okay, here's what, to talk a little bit about what we have to do to bring those things into balance, and then to talk about the schedule that we are undertaking that gets us there with milestones. Okay, that by the second meeting, we're going to go over this. The third meeting, we're going to hopefully be at this point and with a decision point, with a solid decision point in terms of this is where we project the end of feasibility. This is the design that we have, and these are the parameters for square footage and cost that we think we can agree on. Okay, I think that's the first 2 months of work. Okay, to tell you the truth, to get to there, and then we move into schematic design for that alternative. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah.
It's the cost stuff is hard. It's always hard. I mean, I've been in 3 building projects, and I've never been in one where they didn't have this set of trade-offs between community ability to pay and educational program and all the things people want in the building. And it's good that we're doing it now. To be quite honest with you, it probably occurred too late with the high school. We came to Jesus a little bit too late, okay, at the end of schematic design, which is not when you want to do it from that experience, to tell you the truth, okay? So having this now is the right thing to do, okay? And because of the pause in COVID, we have an ability to do it, and to do it in a good way. The other thing is, if whatever the committee, my goal is to get a design that the committee approves, that the town will approve. And if it's a bigger building, if we decide that it has to be a bigger building to do that, it has to be a bigger building to do that. I'm not there yet, but I do believe very much in the team teaching model that Lori and Justin have outlined, and I think we want to preserve that. That's a number one thing to preserve, because I think that's the core of where we think we're going. Okay.
I'm going to speak for a parent with students that could potentially go to this school. I completely agree with that. I think team teaching is the way to go at that vulnerable middle school age, and having all of these instructors really get to know their core group of students. And I think I fully believe that that model is critical to what we're doing here. And that's just as a parent. That's not as an architect or anything else. It's just as a parent.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the crisis that we're operating in now has proven how much it matters, actually, even more so because we're staying much closer to kids. And we actually rolled it out at the 9th grade this year too. And I'll tell you what a lifesaver it's turned into for that incoming 9th grade class trying to get used to high school this way. So I agree, we can do a better job communicating it and the how and why and all of that. But yeah, thank you.
The other part of the context that's important for us to remember is, given what's happened with the pandemic, I mean, it's very hard to predict. Okay, I think there's hope relating to the vaccines, and we'll see how that rolls out over the next year. But I think the whole financial impact continues to be questionable at best, okay, and difficult. in most probability. I think over the next year or two, where it's going to be a battle to get aid to local and state governments. It's going to be a real battle to get that through the political process, and that's going to cascade down, and there will be pressure. Not having that aid, there will be pressure on the towns from the lack of revenue that they have for businesses and all that. We're all aware of that. And Stephen can comment to this, but if in the next year or two, putting this in front of the town, there is going to be some financial uncertainty. And I think we have to, at the very least, demonstrate to the town that we have looked at this in great detail. And this is, this is what we can do in terms of the financials to achieve the educational program that we want. And Stephen, you can comment on that. I don't.
Sure. So good to see everybody again. Been a while. And can I just, Tim, I think you said it well. This is more of a comment about the discussion. I think I said this at an early on meeting. I think this is all the discussion that you've had in the presentation and the work that Court and Charlie put into this is all very good and very normal. In most projects, you design the building you really want, and then when you get that, you're like, whoa. So how can we get, kind of repackage this or make some tough decisions to move forward with a building that makes more sense across all fronts? And so I think this process has been relatively, and like you said, Tim, it has been at the right time, and I think the work that you guys are doing is going to really help the success of the project eventually. So thank you for that. In terms of the financial part of it, I guess I would say there's two ways to look at the economic impact of COVID-19, and at least two ways. And we look at it from multiple angles, but the big one is property tax collections and other revenue. So there's meals tax, lodging taxes, airplane fuel taxes. I mean, we have a lot of local receipts. Those have obviously suffered greatly, and that's when the town revised its budget for FY21. The reductions were really a reflection of the loss of those local receipts and other revenues. And I think we anticipate a reduction in state aid in FY22. If you see that the state is very, very close to finishing their FY21 budget, and includes, I think, over $1 billion in, what we would call operational stabilization, what they call rainy day funds. So they've used over $1 billion in reserves to hold local aid harmless for FY21. I don't see them having the ability to do that in FY22, but that's, we don't know yet. We're a ways away from knowing that. That's for the operating budget. That's for how you pay people and supplies and costs to keep the trains running. But the cost to build the railroad, I think, is much more reflective of property tax collections. And I'll just say, so far, property tax collections have remained very, very strong in Concord. And so the cost to construct this middle school is really borne on the property tax collection that's not impacted by the local receipts. And so if, as we get closer, the quarters of property tax collection rates of payment remain strong and the real estate market remains strong, which both things are still yes as we sit here today. I think if the committee brings forward a good value proposition for the middle school to the community, it will get serious consideration. I don't see, and maybe I don't know the town well enough, but I do think from a like I said, a value proposition standpoint, I don't think it would be perceived as, tone deaf or out of left field or, bad timing to bring this forward. I think the community knows this needs to happen at some point in time. And like I said, if people still have the ability to pay, which would be evidenced by high 90th percentile rates of property tax collections, then I don't see a reason why we couldn't present something that is a good value for Concord residents that's going to sustain those values, which are driven by the strength of the residential real estate market. So that was kind of a long answer to a short question, but I just want to let you know that I am thinking about this part of it, and we are looking at it. And Lori and I talk quite a bit about budgets and finances looking forward, and we took a very conservative approach in FY21 to make sure that FY22 is manageable. And so I think we had this in mind when we were doing all that.
It's encouraging.
Okay, so my takeaway is I'm going to continue my work with Mike and Kristen to work on the schedule. Okay, we'll have a meeting, and my guess is we'll revert back to the Thursday early meetings for the big group, and it'll be in the first or second week of December. I'll get working on that. That meeting will kind of talk about the high level of what we're doing, where we are. We sort of reset everybody where we are, talk about the schedule a little bit, and talk about the desire, as I talked about there, to balance these three things and what we're doing with per square footage cost, space, et cetera. And we'll get going again. In the meantime, I would like at that to present a version of this to the full committee. There was a series of questions that Lori said she hadn't looked at it in terms of the data that we're using for what CMS is. I would like to resolve as much of that as we can before we present that again to the full committee. I think to scrub it a little bit more to give that overview, because I think the comparison to both MSBA and to comparable schools is a valuable thing for the committee to revisit. Okay, so if we could do that for that meeting, that would be great. And then Don, and also to perhaps if we can again, if you can for that first meeting to give some high level indication of the drivers that we're looking at that would look at the per square foot cost a little bit.
I can, and it's just worth noting that Kristen and Lorraine were doing the same thing as far as comparing to other middle schools and cost. So if they would, Kristen, if you would share the Excel spreadsheet that we were looking at that day with me, it's helpful to have comparable projects that are underway and what phase they're in and what their costs are coming at, because just like it's informational, you know, it's not always an apples to apples comparison, but you can look at the size of the school. Do they have an auditorium? Don't they? Not every middle school does, for obvious reasons with the MSBA and what they allow and whatnot. So there are some comps, if you will, some projects that are comparable from a cost standpoint. So we can certainly put something together for that first meeting, Tim. That might be informative. No decisions made, just sort of looking at the numbers.
Great, thank you.
So,
I mean, the one other thing we're near the end, but remember, you walk away from many of these discussions and I have another project saying, oh God, we're compromising, you know, and there is inherent compromise to everything, but also always remember that at the end of the project, there's going to be a beautiful new school, okay, that has space that is specifically designed to support a team leading, a team process, that in itself. And yes, there may be some compromises in specific things about what this individual group does and everything, but there's going to be an incredible lift just to the fact that you have a beautiful new school, okay, that is designed with intent to support an educational vision that we believe in, and that will occur.
Yeah.
Okay, even though there may be some compromises inherent to it.
That is what we told the teachers, Tim. Absolutely. As hard as this conversation is, the big picture is still really, really great. So
one of the most difficult things to quantify about this team teaching model is at the same time one of the most critical, and that is the potential for teachers to spontaneously interact around those 80 kids they're responsible for. That they could do that on the fly, hour by hour, is something you don't put in a schedule, but it impacts the lives of kids because of that that know factor, that the engagement factor that doesn't happen in non-team models. So Lori, I'm looking to you to say you're going to have to beat that drum loud and clear so that people know that that doesn't show up on a schedule,
Right.
but it shows up in the minds and hearts of kids and teachers, and how they use 30 seconds in passing 20 times a day, which doesn't happen in traditional models. Because we can help people, if not quantify it on paper, at least understand it conceptually. Tim, I'm going to look to you for guidance on where and how you want to do this scrub or cleanup of, of some presentation, more or less like the one we did today. So we're going to sit tight until we hear from you after you work with all the various players, notably Lori and Kristen.
Can I just give an example, another parent example? I'll be brief, but something that came up with my kindergartner last week that we talked to the teacher about. This is happening even at the elementary level. So I can only imagine, and I don't have a middle schooler yet, that the value in having these teachers responding educationally, socially, all of the needs that these students have. Had conversations with the teacher last week about something with my child. Not a big deal, but wanted to address it. And then he's home now, remote learning for another week or so, and overheard a friendship group, if anyone knows what that is. At the elementary level, they get 4 or 5 kids together and do these friendship groups. They get to know each other. It's a great social interaction. Overheard him addressing something that we talked to his teacher about last week. I didn't talk to the friendship teacher. I don't even know her, but I overheard him say something and then followed up with a conversation at dinner last night saying, hey, what were you talking about? And he talked about what we were working. And I was like, good for them. Like, as a parent, like, that's why I moved to Concord. And so you expand that at a middle school level, I can only imagine the value. So that's like a tiny glimpse. And I wouldn't have even known they addressed it, except that I'm here to overhear it, because he's home. So these are just little, as a parent, examples of how a small value goes a long way. So just thought I'd share. They're doing great things, Lori.
Great story, Dawn. It's unfortunate how you got there. Dawn's lucky enough to pull the card with the whole class quarantined for 2 weeks. So.
The 1K5.
The only time we've done this.
I'd like to add to something on the team teaching issue. I made a couple comments about this earlier, but I think, when Cord and I did this analysis, we were extremely supportive throughout the discussion of the team teaching model. And, thoughts were, well, why don't we think about this? Why don't we think about that? And we said, well, team teaching seems to be baked in. Let's just run with that as the basis for the analytical stuff that we do. That said, I don't think, getting back to describing what team teaching really is, I think what we really do need to do is to describe team teaching in terms of what it is exactly that teachers do and what spaces do they require in which to do those things. What are the rules? How does team teaching impact space is what the question is. And I don't think we really know. I think we've talked a lot about split teams and disadvantages, and we need prep teams, different prep rooms models and so forth and so on, dedicated rooms for teachers. Let's get this written down in a way that everybody can understand and get behind. And then let's, take it from there. I think that's going to be very important for us going forward.
And if some of it's going to be anecdotal, let's get really good with the anecdotal, because it's not all going to show on a spreadsheet.
Well, the anecdotal can at some point is something that we want to foster. We want those things. If somehow ad hoc blah 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 is going on, well, let's make sure we account for that in terms of the design of the building. I think design to some extent follows function. Maybe there's a lot of discussion you can have about that, but we need to understand what teachers do, what kids do, and what this means in terms of space. That's all I'm saying, and that has to be written down.
I don't know, it might have been Kristen 8 months ago who I think, said it so well in my memory, Kristen, about how design and human behavior are what we have to couple together in all of this. And I think that's what you're speaking to, Charlie. I'm mindful it's 9:56. I wonder if we can just go around the room and see if we have any closeout comments or things to put in the parking lot for later, how we can close this out. I'm just going to call out people as I see them on the screen. Matt, can I turn to you? Are you comfortable with what we've covered? And I'll come back to you in a second, Stephen. Matt?
Yes, I think this is great. Thank you for asking the questions. I would just add that it seems to me, I guess I'm less interested in direct comparisons to Gates and other schools on the kind of room by room level. Like, I mean, I understand they do tricks to get around MSBA, but I think defending the space allocation that we are developing and fully understanding why we want it the way it is what's crucial.
Got it. Thank you. We knew Chris had to leave at 9:45. I know Dawn's got another meeting. I think we've heard from all the subcommittee members. Mike, anything else before we wrap?
Just to Tim's point earlier, Kristen and I are, the teams are working on a schedule update, and we'll continue to do that. I know the last draft we sent over to Kristen maybe a day or two ago, so we're going to be working on that. And I think overall, just getting a better understanding to what Charlie said and what Lori has said about, getting some of this down on paper so that we have something that we can present and then actually justify, the ultimate goal here is to justify, or to be able to justify what we need to make this work financially, educational plan wise, sustainability, getting everything in there and being able to have that conversation, whether it's with an individual from the public or the select board or whatever, but just being able to explain, how we got to this point and why we're going forward with the recommended option, wherever that ends up.
Got it. Thank you. Matt? I know you've been attentive, Matt Rice. Anything to add, or are we good to go?
Yep. Good from my perspective.
Okay,
Straight
thank
to
you.
just hear the dialogue and understand where we are.
Wonderful. Thank you. Kristen?
Same. Thank you very much. We have a lot of information to collect and pull together.
All right. So we'll turn to Lori, and then if our chairs think we can adjourn, we'll do so. Lori, anything else for now?
No, thank you all. It's great to be back in this discussion.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Didn't get easier though.
More than once or twice, which is great.
All right. Well, I hope everybody has a very safe Thanksgiving. Take care of everybody
Okay.
you care for.
Thanks, Court.
I wonder, is there a motion to adjourn, please?
So moved.
And a second, please?
Second.
And a second from Matt. Thank you very much. Take care, all. Those in favor, we do a roll call. We're going to do Zoom protocol. Matt
Yes.
and Lori
Yes.
and Charlie
Yes.
and Court, yes. And that closes us out. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone. Thanks, Court. Thanks, everyone.